Excellent. Well, please be seated, and I'll begin to introduce our second and final panel for our discussion of Russia and the North Korean nuclear and missile program. For this panel, we have four very esteemed guests to discuss not only the Russian perspective, but also, I think, put more emphasis this panel on the Korean perspective and particularly understanding North Korea. So again, we have Renz Lee, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're also joined this time by Bill Severe, who's an expert in nuclear weapons. I'm very pleased to have him join us. In addition, we have Sumi Terry of CSIS, the incoming Korea chair there, and finally Jenny Town of Johns Hopkins joining us today. So I'll start by turning it over to Renz Lee for about 10 or 12 minutes of comments, and then we'll go down to the remainder of our panelists, and then finally open it up to you for questions. So Renz, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. North Korea is a pretty tough, intractable problem. It's very easy to be pessimistic about U.S. policy toward North Korea because nothing really seems to have worked very well, and our policies we still keep doing the same thing. We're locked into the idea of economic sanctions. We're locked in the idea of relying on China to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And I think really these policies have not been very well conceived. I'm going to talk a little bit about sanctions, talk a little bit about China, and then I'm going to discuss the rather iffy prospects of a diplomatic settlement of the current nuclear crisis. I believe in the idea of diplomatic settlement, diplomatic negotiations. I think this is the only way to go, but there are formidable obstacles in the way of getting anything accomplished. So one of our failed policies has been the reliance on economic coercion as a policy tool. Successive rounds of UN sanctions have caused certainly some economic pain in North Korea, but they have not appreciably affected Pyongyang's nuclear thinking or behavior. In fact, they might have even reinforced it. That's another argument. There's simply too many ways to circumvent sanctions, from the use of shell companies, embassies, foreign flagged vessels, to outsourcing to China, and to overt criminal operations such as drug trafficking, counterfeiting, and particularly now digital hijacking of bank accounts and other sources of wealth. Digital crimes bring the North Koreans an estimated $1 billion a year, which is enough, I think, to offset the impact of UN sanctions on exports of the North's main commodities: coal, iron ore, and fish products. Furthermore, Pyongyang benefits from very weak international enforcement. Most UN member states, I believe at least, could care less about the North's nuclear transgressions, or they benefit from the status quo, or they brazenly collude with Pyongyang's evasion practices for business reasons. Now, another aspect of U.S. policy that I think has been really not very successful has been what Artyom Lukin calls America's obsession with China as the only way forward to solve the North Korean nuclear problem. This has tended to, and this is one of the reasons why we did the project, this has tended to overshadow the potentially valuable contributions of other regional players to resolving the nuclear issue, most notably Russia, of course. China is a very powerful economic player. It controls most of Pyongyang's external trade, but Beijing has been a reluctant partner in international sanctions against the North. And we see a lot of evidence of this, despite some of the media reporting. which makes it appear as though China is on board. Well, at the end of the day, China is not going to be completely on board with sanctions. Consider that China and the United States have very different perceptions of the Kim regime. The United States would like to see the regime disappear, whereas China wants to prevent its collapse, fearing that this would usher in a U.S.-backed South Korean state on its doorstep and shift the Asian balance of power to Beijing's disadvantage in its competition with the United States for primacy in the Asia Pacific. Now, Washington's latest strategy, well, it's not a completely new strategy, but it's had a lot more emphasis recently, has been to provide, or to promote, rather, denuclearization through dialogue and negotiations with the North. Even Donald Trump, who once said that talking to North Korea is a waste of time, now says that North Korea should come to the table and make a deal. Of course, it would have been better to negotiate with the North 5 years ago when Kim Jong-il had first come to power than today when North Korea is flush with the successes in nuclear and ballistic missile advances. Sort of a sleep at the wheel issue here. I don't want to get into in great detail. The initial challenge of a diplomatic approach, of course, is getting Pyongyang's leaders to agree to talks. Even given the deep hostility in U.S.-North Korean relations, there may be a useful mediating role, and we've talked about this a little bit before today, a useful mediating role here from Moscow. Or so we talk about this in our report. Russia's historical ties to the DPRK and its experience in dealing with the Kim dynasty translate into better relations with Pyongyang than any other country of consequence, and that includes China. Engaging Russia over North Korea may be the best way to bring Pyongyang to the bargaining table and put together the outlines of a deal. Okay. The sticking point in negotiations, of course, is what to do about North Korea's nuclear arsenal. The West has very little leverage on Pyongyang's nuclear decisions. Piling on more sanctions is not going to really change things very much. It's not going to change Pyongyang's calculus appreciably. As Vladimir Putin recently remarked, the North Koreans would rather eat grass than abandon their nuclear weapons. And neither will, I think, bribes, for example, lifting sanctions, infusions of foreign aid, pathway to U.S. diplomatic recognition, security, and the like. The North Koreans trust their nukes more than they trust the West's promises, and they're probably right. At a recent speech in South Korea, U.S. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis said that I cannot imagine a condition under which the United States can accept North Korea as a nuclear power. Well, the North Koreans don't see it this way. Would the United States maybe consider a deal that falls short of all-out and immediate nuclear disarmament for North Korea? And here we get into some suggestions of possible approaches. I really don't know how realistic they are, what the North Koreans would, what their reactions would be. But one idea already mentioned today has been the idea of a moratorium or freeze on testing of nuclear weapons and long-range ballistic missiles. This would have the advantage, I think, of cutting the ICBM threat to the continental United States. I mean, there's a big advantage of this. A second policy would be to somehow negotiate a cap on the North's production of nuclear weapons, which means shuttering facilities for the production of plutonium, and also placing controls on uranium enrichment to prevent production of highly enriched uranium. Now, both of these ideas would leave North Korea as a de facto nuclear state for a while, but certainly a less threatening one. However, this is not going to be a permanent situation. We can't really leave things there. And I think the coordinated diplomacy of the United States and the primary regional powers, meaning Russia and China, especially, eventually is going to push the North farther down the road of denuclearization toward a more comprehensive and agreeable settlement. I apologize for my voice, but I hope you could hear the substance of the talk.
Thank you. Bill?
Okay, good. This has been really an interesting subject to work on for more or less the last year. It's been a lot of fun as it's twists and turns and changes every day, and I think we've managed to somehow get a pretty decent paper out of it all, and I'm very pleased, and I hope you all have a chance to really look through it and read it in some detail, because I think you'll find a good deal of information. But what I would like to do today is try and give a little bit different perspective on the whole situation in North Korea. That's just by way of background. I'm State Department, IAEA, Los Alamos National Laboratory. So I've spent my whole career working with things like bombs and missiles and disarmament negotiations. So, you know, this is really my interest. So if you'll kind of allow me, let me try to present to you what I would see as a different perspective on what's going on in the North. You know, Chris had mentioned that this looked like there's kind of a disagreement, you know, at an expert level. I'm not sure that it's just a disagreement at an expert level. I think it's just a cultural disagreement on the way that we tend to see things sometimes. Let me kind of go through the North Koreans' program, you know, piece at a time. First, let's talk about nuclear. Okay, they've demonstrated they can achieve a nuclear detonation. No question about that. The most recent destination had an estimated yield about 250 KT and kilotons, and you know that's a pretty respectable yield size. However, you know you shouldn't jump to the conclusion that that's a hydrogen bomb either, because you know I maybe some of you with better access to information have seen evidence indicating that they detonated a hydrogen bomb in the test site. I haven't seen it. But simply the fact that you've got a yield of that size does not mean that you've detonated a hydrogen bomb, or that you even have the technology to detonate a hydrogen bomb. In fact, the 250 kilotons is about half the yield of what the U.S.'s largest non-fusion, or just using HEU only weapon was, which is 500 kilotons, which was a deployable weapon way back in like 52 or something like that. So, I mean, it's, I think, inappropriate to start jumping to conclusions and thereby kind of panicking ourselves about the capability of others. And we need to more closely look exactly what it is. What have they done? They have a nuclear detonation capability. I won't use the word weapon, because you know I'm just not convinced that that part's true either. And you know it's a large leap of logic to go from being able to detonate a device to having a practically usable weapon. It's very much an unknown what the size, weight, composition of North Korea's nuclear devices would be. It's unknown whether they can produce a physics package that's basically ruggedized It could be assembled and it could be used as a weapon, either as a bomb or as a missile. It's not clear. I know everyone saw the picture of Kim Jong-un with the supposed hydrogen bomb next to him. Well, okay, maybe it's a hydrogen bomb. Maybe it's just a big cylinder full of air, for all I know. It doesn't prove anything. The fact that Kim Jong-un says something doesn't convince me of anything, and I think we should, strive to remain unconvinced until we can look at the facts and look at the information that we can collect ourselves. Talk now a little bit about the North Korea missile program. Okay, they can launch a missile. It goes up, it comes down. Great. That's, when I was a kid, I had this, I made little missiles and things too. I was trying to be a little scientist, and I shot them. They went up, they came down too. That didn't give me an ICBM, and it doesn't give these guys an ICBM either. Theoretically, it might have enough range to reach the continental United States. Fine, it's a big nose cone full of air is reaching the United States. There's a lot more to having a credible nuclear weapon than just being able to make it go up and make it come down. Gravity does the come down part. So there's a lot more for that. It's not clear if they had any payload in these texts. If I was just trying to scare the other guys, and how far I could launch something, I'd just launch it empty, up and down, like my little things when I was 10 years old. If you have an ICBM, and I see there's a lot of talk about ICBM, Kim Jong-un says we have an ICBM, so everyone believes they have an ICBM. Well, maybe, but I don't think so. If you have an intercontinental ballistic missile that's in any way credible, it's got to be able to fly a credible payload, meaning a nuclear weapon, downrange, and it's got to have some accuracy because, you can't just shoot it off in any direction. It has to be done fairly accurately, and the weapon has to be delivered intact, which goes back to the first part. Do they have a ruggedized package or not? Who knows? But they've never done any of these things. They've never demonstrated that they can shoot something downrange. That's something we do out of Vandenberg, a couple times a year, just to make sure that our nuclear weapons will fire and work just the way they're designed. These guys have never done any such thing. It has to fly downrange, it has to get to the target, it has to arm itself, and it has to fire more or less at the right time. Otherwise, it's a joke. And that's the thing we kind of keep in mind. There's no demonstrated capability of being a nuclear weapon, used to deliver a nuclear weapon. It took the U.S. years to do this. I know times have changed, but I'm just not going to believe that, miracle, the North Koreans have suddenly discovered how to do something that it took the U.S. probably a good 7-8 years to do itself. Okay, now, I think that's a lot of questions to me, and I hope you have a little bit of a questioning mind too, is maybe they don't have all that stuff that they say they have. And maybe we shouldn't be buying it just so outright because Kim Jong-un says that they have, they don't. They need to demonstrate it somehow. Now let's look at how Kim may see things. He darn well knows what he has and what he doesn't have. And the one thing I think he knows more than anything else is he wants to survive. He wants his regime to survive. He doesn't want to end up like Saddam Hussein. He doesn't want to end up like Muammar Gaddafi, being killed after kind of compromising with the U.S. He's got a lot of imperatives, and the basis of that imperative is that he and his regime survive. Now, what kind of idiot, and I mean, it's just not insane, but idiot, would fire a nuclear weapon or a missile, hopefully they try to put a nuclear weapon in it, at the United States, trying to hit somewhere in the continental United States with a nuclear weapon, knowing that the only thing that would happen for sure, they don't know if the weapon will work, they don't know if it'll fly to target, they don't know if it'll arm, they don't know if it'll burn up on re-entry. There's a lot of unknowns. This may or may not work, but I'm going to shoot at these guys anyway, and I know the certain outcome is that I will be killed along with probably several million of my North Korean friends. No one's that darn stupid, and he's not that stupid either. He is not stupid, he is not crazy. He's, I think, bluffing. But, we need to, what I want to encourage is we need to look at the facts, not at the fears. Okay, what are the U.S. options now? I heard a couple, and I think I have three myself. So, yeah, we don't have a lot of good options right now, as we pointed out in the paper. They're just we're really limited. We've spent the last 8 years, and probably most of the 8 years before that, pursuing strategic patience, during which time the North Koreans could only build their regime and their nuclear capabilities, missile and weapon capabilities greater and greater. I mean, they've been building while we've been sitting. First off, I just can't imagine that Donald Trump wants to continue doing the same failed policy for his administration that has been done in the last two administrations. I just can't imagine that he wants to do that. Let's see if he does. But I guess one option would be we continue to threaten them. We continue to tweet at them. We continue to pile sanctions on them. And, as everyone in this paper and the discussion here has said, this is pretty darn ineffective. It doesn't happen. And, from my experience with sanctions work great the first time you use them. When they're unexpected, you sanction a few entities. They work great. But, as you use them over and over again, the guys on the other side learn how to build front companies faster than you can shut the old ones down. It's just a failing proposition. So sanctions do fail. If we go this path, North Korea will simply continue to build more nuclear weapons, improved nuclear weapons, more missiles, improved accuracy missiles. I mean, we will just continue to lose. It's a total losing proposition. Move on to losing proposition number 2. And that's what we launch a strike on North Korea to remove Kim and his nuclear threat. I will pretty much guarantee he is not going to go down peacefully. I think it's totally his intention of having a small nuclear capability to say, okay, if I die, you die too. And he means it. Largely, the outcome of that would be, probably the least bad, would be major confrontation on the Korean Peninsula, use of nuclear weapons in the north, lots of radiation gets spread everywhere. At the worst, it could mean that it spreads to the rest of Northeast Asia as well, because there are security arrangements between countries that sometimes get triggered when such events happen. Certainly with China, certainly with Russia, there's a mutual security agreements. Depends on whether they trigger or not, but they well could, and it well could lead to a wider war in East Asia. Well, those are the two really lousy outcomes, and it's sort of what we're faced with, unless we want to, consider outcome number 3, which would be we develop a strategy leading to negotiations. And that's something I think that's been lacking. Strategic patience is not a strategy. We need to discuss internally how we will bring things about. Things I wrote down real quick while I was doing some notes here. No more threats. No more talk of regime change. And give up on that idea of immediate denuclearization. You don't have to give it up forever, but give it up on it happening immediately. That's not going to happen. I know I've mentioned in the paper the example of South Africa walking away. And I'd like to use a couple good examples after giving all the bad news. I'd like to give a little bit of good news here, is that there are examples of countries that have been either very close to developing nuclear weapons or have actually had them that have given them up and walked away from them. I think first that comes to mind would be Argentina and Brazil. Years and years of rivalry that's gone on with Argentina and Brazil with the nuclear programs. Certainly with Brazil pursuing a nuclear navy and getting pretty darn far along with some nuclear weapon design possibilities. All that ended when they reduced the tension between the two states. They talked to each other more, and they finally formed a joint inspectorate where the Argentinians and the Brazilians both go together in little joint teams to inspect each other's facility and to make sure that the other guys are doing everything they say they're doing. And I might even see that as a way long time from now. Could be something that could happen on the Korean Peninsula someday. It's a good way when you both go together, you learn each other, and you also see what the others are doing. And the other example I was referring to complete denuclearization was South Africa. it had 6 nuclear weapons. It could have delivered them. It would have been a little bit of a tacky delivery out of the back of a cargo plane or something like that, but they could have done it. They were armed and ready. But changes in the international community and climate took away that level of threat to the South African government that had existed while the Soviet Union had been bent on taking over South Africa by one way or the other. And the U.S., maybe particularly with President Carter, had been determined that they would sanction South Africa until the cows come home. The situation changed a little bit in the Reagan administration when they backed off on the sanctions. They started talking about more cooperative efforts. We actually delivered some of the things that we had made them pay for and failed to deliver. We started to show a little bit of good faith. And at the same time, the Soviet Union began to disappear. That took the pressure off. Certainly, U.S. actions at that time made progress possible. And eventually, they made the decision to give up their nuclear weapons. They dismantled, disassembled them, and within about, I think, 3-4 years thereafter, the major change in the South African regime, end of apartheid, free and open elections, everything that we could have ever wanted, and it all came, I believe, from us being willing, to be patient, to negotiate, and to make a deal go through. Now, how would the negotiations with North Korea work? That's a little bit more difficult subject than either of the two previous. For any kind of negotiation, you need time, you need trust. You've got to do confidence building in a step-by-step approach. You do have to really realize, too, that there's going to be a few stumbles along the way. I've never been involved in a negotiation process that there wasn't some major obstacle that's basically blocking the path. Someone's changed their mind, someone's done, and you just have to go back, okay, you work through it very, very patiently, and you'll come to a conclusion in the end. You need to be able to make substantive compromise. And this is something that I think North Korea is going to be very sensitive about, because they did, at one time, give up their plutonium production reactor and the associated facilities, and they were destroyed, blown up, collapsed completely to the ground. They had put their stockpile, you'd say, of plutonium under international safeguards, and pretty much had given away their program. Now, of course, at the same time, there were some other things going on that they probably should have thought through a little bit better. Certainly developing a uranium enrichment program was something they probably should have thought through before they just kind of said, oh, by the way. And not a good thought, but it's one of those kind of things that if you're working working together to try to come to a conclusion, you've got to realize that happens. They could very easily say, well, where's that reactor you guys promised us? I don't know. How about that fuel oil that was supposed to arrive? You can cast blame on every side, but casting blame doesn't help. What you got to do is you got to be committed to working through the situation and coming to good compromises, and they need to be substantive. And I think that's the point I'd like to make here. If we say, okay, we won't have any more military maneuvers with the South, well, that's great. The North should probably like that, but what's the substance to it? If the U.S. or the South Koreans change their mind in 6 months from now, well, we can have them again. It's got to be something that's a substantive contribution. It can't be it can't be just words. It's got to be something really of substance, and that's going to make this process very hard. One of the most unfortunate thing is the lack of trust in the U.S. and North Korea situation. I'd say there is no trust, or if there is such a thing as antitrust, it would be antitrust. And here's the bottom line of our paper here is why we've included Russia in this paper so strongly, and what it could possibly do is that it likely has the best chance to take a role as an intermediary, not to do negotiation. It's going to have to be the U.S. and the North Koreans ultimately, but for the Russians to give substantial support in all ways that they can to make sure this gets started, it stays on track, do a little hand-holding with both sides, not an easy prospect considering the current climate in the U.S. On Russian relations, but it's, at least in my point of view, it's the only way I see to move forward unless others have a good idea, which I'd be glad to hear that. But I think Russia probably would be very interested in doing this. You know, I heard you say a little earlier, you know, you think they might be willing to consider Japan and South Korea having nuclear weapons. I don't think so. Okay. You have to understand it in larger than just the Northeast Asia context, because, you know, you have to look at it globally, because if we start going in that direction where we give one country or two countries nuclear weapons because they don't like the guys next to them, then do we give the Saudis nuclear weapons against the Iranians, which we don't like? Do the Russians give the Syrians nuclear weapons like they were trying to start their own program earlier to protect them from whoever else? You know, you start a cascade that you really don't want to start. So I think Russia has a strong interest in not doing that. And I'm getting ready to say goodbye here. And I guess I can say goodbye at this point. I think my time probably expired a long time ago. I'm sorry, Chris.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. We'll now have two comments. First, Sumi.
Thank you to the presenters and writers for this very thoughtful paper and presentation. I don't have to get into the details with this audience how North Korea has been the most vexing problem, foreign policy problem for us for decades now. So we do need a creative solution, a creative idea. So I welcome that. I applaud your effort to come up with something interesting that we have not discussed ad nauseum. So thank you. And I think your main point was that U.S. should consider the constructive role that Russia could play in defusing the North's nuclear and missile ambitions. So I'm going to just make an overall general comment and then try to address some of the specific points that you guys brought up in my allotted time. So I want to begin with this thought. North Korea's quest for the nuclear program and its actions, like this week's ICBM test, they're not reactions only or simply self-defensive measures against threatening Washington. In other words, these actions are not simply reactions to external stimuli or U.S. hostile foreign policy only, or even Trump's hostile policy. The fact is North Korea has relentlessly pursued their nuclear program for decades. And its strategic reasons, they have their own strategic reasons for doing their own rationale for doing why they need this program. And they're at the final stage of completing the program. I'm going to talk a little bit about technical stuff because you brought it up. They are at the final stage of completing the program. What is completing the program? They want to be able to have a nuclear-tipped ICBM that could reach United States. And you guys also talk about how it's highly unlikely for North Korea to give up their nuclear arsenal for any amount of political or economic concessions. I mentioned this because one of the key points that in the paper they talk about is they talk a lot about from Russia's perspective, how Russia wants to play a constructive role in resolving the North Korean crisis because it increases their international status, and how Russia would reap diplomatic and economic benefits from resolving the crisis, which I agree. I agree with that argument. It's in Russia's interest to defuse the crisis, and Washington could use their interest in the deal. But unfortunately, here's the problem. North Korea is bent on completing the program. It's North Korea that's key into resolving this crisis, right? It's what North Korea wants. So we need to get at that. So I think it will be helpful to sort of explain how we can change North Korea's calculation and strategic thinking. In their statements and in their actions, North Korea could not be more clear. They are not interested in talking about denuclearization anymore. They said repeatedly over in conversations, track 2 talks, in their official statements, that nuclear weapons are now off the table. They have repeatedly said their strategic objective is credible nuclear deterrent. What that means, as I said, it's a nuclear warhead that could be delivered anywhere to the United States. This is their long-term goal. Just last month, North Korean Foreign Ministry official Choi Sun-hee reiterated their statements by saying nuclear arsenal is meant to deter attack from the United States, and the keeping weapons is matter of life and death. So the question is, for this life and death matter, after pursuing nuclear weapons for decades at cost of billions of dollars, at a cost of millions of lives, what can we now bring to the table that will make North Korea change its calculation? And so that's my point. So I think it's how realistic is it to assume at this juncture that North Korea, after North Korea completed about 90% of its program, when they're, I believe, one technical step away, and that's re-entry vehicle capability, that they are now going to rethink this calculation about the need to have nuclear weapons. And since you guys brought up the nuclear capabilities, I just want to quickly address that point. You talk about how it could be an elaborate bluff, cleverly staged deterrence strategy, that's the words from the paper, to ward off potential attackers like United States. That we have not seen them have a nuclear weapon, they have not really landed anywhere, and so on. You've heard the argument. Well, I can tell you, having worked from the intelligence community, and I worked at the Central Intelligence Agency, I worked at the National Intelligence Council, where we oversaw 16 intelligence agencies. Our problem when it comes to North Korea is not overestimating their capability. Maybe we've done that with Iraq, maybe we've done it with other countries, but we have consistently underestimated their capability, and every single time they caught us off guard. So I do think there's some risk involved in thinking that, oh, they can kite there, this is kind of a bluff, they have continually demonstrated that we underestimated them. They just had an ICBM test with you said it just went up and down, but it's 8,100 mile, that's the estimate range. That means they do have a missile that could be delivered to the United States. We can talk about miniaturization, and I'm not saying they are there, but they're feverishly working on it. They're close to getting there. There are no stopping. So it's there. So let's not just say they're not there yet, so we can just relax and they're bluffing. I think there's some risk involved in that. On the sanctions, because both of you brought up sanctions, and so a lot of sanctions are noted in the paper, and how it has not worked. It says reliance on sanctions as a policy tool has failed. By the way, Kim Jong-un did not meet with Song Tao, the Chinese envoy, recently, just because it just came out that Kim Jong-un wanted China to agree to give some relief on sanctions. I would just say, yes, it's true that even the I agree with this. Even the strictest sanctions and enforcement might not get North Korea, probably won't even get North Korea to change its calculation. So that's fair. But it's not true that U.S. has maintained these comprehensive sanctions for decades on. It really has taken place, comprehensive sanctions has been in place about February, March of last year. And as we all know, and as the authors note in their paper, they have not been enforced because of China. And they got into long discussion about why that is. We know that, why that has been, because China has not been willing to enforce it. But now, it's finally today we do have strict sanctions in place. And China may be doing more. I mean, there's a lot of indication, there's an argument on both sides that China is actually doing more, but we'll have to see. You're absolutely right. China's core strategy might not fundamentally change. But strict sanctions are just now in place. So I just want to make that differentiation. It's not years and years and years of, they were very weak sanctions. And then in terms of negotiations, it's better to have negotiated with Kim Jong-un 5 years ago. We did. I just want to also remind this audience that every turn, this is not a new crisis. This is not Trump's problem. This is not, this has started in the early 1990s. This is through Bill Clinton years, 2-term Bush years, 2-term Obama years, and now Trump. And at every turn we tried. That's why we have 1994 Agreed Framework. We had a bilateral agreement. We had multilateral agreements under the Bush years. It's unfortunate because he called, he came in, he pursued a little bit of hardline policy, called North Korea excess of evil. There's all kinds of things that went wrong. But he returned to the multilateral negotiation. Even the Obama administrations, when a lot of critics like to say, hey, you didn't really try, you sat there and did nothing. There were repeated attempts to negotiate with North Koreans. 2009, when Bill Clinton went to get those girls out, those 2 journalists out, soon after that, he also asked for talks and denuclearization talks. Later that year, former late Steve Bosworth, the nuclear envoy, he went out to North Korea to see if we can invite them to talks. And he came back empty-handed. I know I can just give you a whole list of the exact time and date when we try to find time to negotiate with them. I know I'm running out of time. So just make, and even when Kim Jong-un came into power, they said, oh, it's now a different leader. It's not Kim Jong-il. Let's negotiate. We did. That's called Leap Day deal, which fell apart within 3 weeks. So I think I think we need to keep all this in perspective. And my key question then is this: I do think we are kind of stuck, because I don't see a way out where North Korea is going to get off this nuclear missile path that they're on. And I think we're pretty serious now, saying we don't think there's change. But if we say, we cannot accept nuclear North Korea, and that's something that we can discuss, I do think we have to learn to live with it. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't live with it. I do think we should. But something has to give at some point. But I'm out of my time, so I'll talk to you during Q&A.
Great, thank you very much. Jenny?
Great, thank you. And thanks to FPRI for inviting me today. I've known Renz, I met him when this project started, and so it's great to see the final product. And I would really recommend for everyone to actually read the papers, because I think there is a lot of good information there, and a little different perspective of how to look at the situation. I think the papers really do highlight the deep historical ties that North Korea and Russia has. But I do think it a little bit overstates maybe how that translates into influence, especially in the security sphere. And I think the panel before us talked a lot about, this perception gap, the idea that, Russia is not North Korea's enemy, China is not North Korea's enemy. And so there's always going to be limits to how far their political influence is going to run when it comes to, especially on the nuclear issues, because their credibility, even as a mediator, is really going to be limited on North Korea's belief that Russia or China could bring the US to the table as well. So if they do what Russia and China want, if they do what Russia suggests is a good idea in order to get the US and North Korea to talk together, if the US then doesn't come to the table on those terms, then what, if you're North Korea, then what are we doing this for? So I think, there's always going to be those limits to how far that can go, but certainly the more cooperation we can have, the better. But it's clear that, there isn't a lot of agreement on what the path forward should be. There isn't a lot of agreement on, what the technical threat really is. There's a lot of different perceptions. Even within the United States, within Russia, there isn't any consensus on, again, the full scope and scale, or, even I think there's a little bit more understanding of probably the motivations behind North Korea's program, but again, this still varies depending on who you're talking to and depending on the actors. But I agree a lot with the concerns of this over-reliance on sanctions. And while we have had greater sanctions this year, the reality is that there has been sanctions in place and growing over time. And it does tend to be sort of our default of we do sanctions until North Korea changes its behavior and then we can talk. And now, even with more crippling sanctions and tighter sanctions and all of this talk about pressure, my question is always, pressure to what end? What are we really trying to accomplish with sanctions? Are we really trying to engineer economic collapse in North Korea? Are we really trying to completely embargo trade and all legal avenues of business for North Korea? And if so, how does North Korea respond to this? And I think a lot of times when we talk about sanctions policy and, cutting North Korea off and isolating North Korea, it also it creates this sort of binary decision-making process for what we think the North Koreans are going to do. And it sort of treats North Korea as a static, passive actor in that process. So the idea that the world will continue to isolate and cut off, and North Korea will keep doing things the exact same way they're doing things now, and it will work less and less over time until their economy collapses, and then they only have one choice left: come back to the table on our terms, denuclearize or die. But history has shown us that North Korea is very good at adaptation, and North Korea is not a static actor, and North Korea is not a passive actor. And I think that the paper highlights a lot of these ways in which they have adapted to the times, including, if you can't use financial, dollar-based financial transactions, there's Chinese banks. If Chinese banks are closing down, now you see a lot of cyber crimes, a lot of cryptocurrencies. You have all of these, all the front companies. And when we talk about sanctions implementation, we can continue to put more and more sanctions on North Korea. It doesn't necessarily mean that implementation improves over time, especially the more demands there are on a system to implement. It doesn't necessarily create more resources for countries to do this. There are plenty of countries that North Korea is working with, not just China, where there's a lot of that's already off the books to begin with. So, is it just lip service that countries are walking away? And then they're just not registering things. And even in the report, they talk a lot about sort of the informal trade numbers versus what's the formal custom numbers to begin with. And so those are all things that you have to watch in that process. But the other thing is, when it comes to this idea that North Korea is a passive and static actor, yes, their economy could contract, and yes, their economy could, the market principles that are going in the active economic growth that they're seeing, and all the things that we actually like to see in the civilian economy can slow down, can be reversed. And another thing that we've learned over time is that North Koreans know how to suffer. They expect at times that things will reverse. They know that that wealth is not necessarily guaranteed and that the economy is always going to go forward. They don't freak out in times of recession as other economies would, like South Korea or the US, for instance. And so the level of suffering and the mechanisms in which the government has to control the population over time during that process are enormous, as we've seen, when the regime can be brutal, and the regime will be brutal if it needs to. And so these are other reasons why, again, if we're looking at what the goal of crippling sanctions is, how far are we willing to let this run? And the more we cut off access to legal channels of trade, the other risk, and I think it's also highlighted in the paper, is, again, as North Korea's adapting, who's then left? And I guarantee you there's always going to be people willing to do trade. And as much as, we worry about North Korea as a proliferation risk now, if you're cutting off all legal channels of trade, their most valuable asset then does actually become their nuclear weapons and their technology. So it's almost as if we're pushing them into this self-fulfilling cycle. I would add to that that the other things, since Kim Jong-un has come to power, Kim Jong-un is not his father. He didn't have the training. He doesn't have the relationships with other foreign leaders. He does seem to be bolder. He's willing to take bigger risks. And I feel like he's been learning all the wrong lessons in the process. And so some of these, and I'll just list a few, is that some of these include that, negotiated deals may not last from one presidential term to the next. That there's also such an aversion to military options and military actions that, does North Korea really believe that's really a viable option? And if it doesn't believe military actions are possible, how far is it willing to push to prove that, these over-the-top threats coming from, the Trump administration now, how far are they willing to push in order to prove that that's a bluff? And is it a bluff? And I think these are the questions that we can't be 100% sure of anymore. And the other thing that, especially with this administration that is different, I think, than past administrations, is that the policy debate in Washington is so public. And it's not just, a differing of opinion in the policy community, but, you can see the cleavages even within the administration. And I think that also creates a lot of room for miscalculation, a lot of room for misinterpretation, it also, if you're North Korea, you're seeing that, this administration may not, what the president says may or may not be true. But, where do you bank? Where do you look? And I think we're all still trying to figure that out. And, how they interpret that over time, I think, again, they've learned the lessons that Kim Jong-un has taken big risks, and so far he's been right. And how does that translate then going forward if we continue doing this path without these diplomatic off-ramps? And this idea of maximum pressure and engagement, the question is when do we get to engagement? What is enough pressure? Is it realistic? And I think the South Africa example, I think, is a good way to start rethinking the situation, and not how do we prevent North Korea from gaining nuclear weapons technology, but how do we now think about how do states exit nuclear weapons programs? I think there needs to be more of this thinking and more of this discussion, because that the horse is already out of the gate, right? Like, they have nuclear weapons technology, even if it's not perfected. We don't necessarily want them to demonstrate it. But certainly they've demonstrated enough for us to believe that they have the technology if they want to continue to pursue that. And so in that case, we're not talking about how do we prevent them from building a uranium enrichment program. We're talking about how do we convince the country now that they don't need these weapons, and that they should reverse that program, and they should give up that program. And I think the one thing that Bill and I agree on is that's not going to be an easy conversation. That's the stronger North Korea gets, the harder that negotiation is going to be. And it's unrealistic to think that that's going to be an immediate end goal for any negotiation that starts. And I'll just leave it there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jenny. We have time for a couple of questions from the audience. After I call on you, we'll have the microphone be handed toward you. Maybe in the middle right there, sir. If you could state your name and introduce yourself as well, please.
Yes. Hi, Joshua Fitt, Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you all for having this panel today. And thank you, Ms. Terry, for your strong assessment and commentary. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you advocate as the best way forward from a U.S. policy standpoint.
I think, minus the rhetoric, which I really don't like because it does absolutely no good, we are on the only path that we can be on, which is trying to pressure the Kim regime through sanctions and other pressure measures, and trying to get China to do more. There's an argument that we know that China has not done that. We know that's why there's an argument for secondary boycott against Chinese entities and banks that do illicit business with North Korea. I'm not saying that's going to lead to denuclearization or Kim Jong-un regime to change its mind. We don't have any other pressure measure. Otherwise, we are looking at a military option. This is only pressure measure in terms of trying to press the regime. Now, I think it will fail, most likely, because we're running out of time. For strong sanctions to get to work, for Iran, it took 3 years. Strong sanctions have been just in place, and maybe China is doing more now. That's been a couple of months. So I say, a lot of people say maybe we need 2 years. Even this is State Department's assessment. We need about 2 years for it to work. North Korea might be a year away from reaching this capability. So we might run out of time. Still, I just, what would happen after is I think we would have to live with nuclear North Korea, because we mentioned, I think one thing we agree on is the regime is not suicidal, ideological. There's no intention of attacking us. There might be other intentions, more aggressive intention, such as more freedom of action in the Korean Peninsula, trying to kick out the U.S. forces off the Korean Peninsula, peace treaty, and try to decouple U.S.-South Korea alliance, and possibly unification on its own terms. But that's all long-term play. We know they're not going to immediately attack us because they don't want for the regime to end. And then the sanctions will still be in place. Now, acknowledging and living is a different thing. We can still say we don't acknowledge, but you still learn to live with it. There was one point, something about defectors. You thought the defectors were not leaving. They're not leaving anymore because life is better in North Korea. Actually, elite defection has increased. And if the defectors are not leaving, if people are not leaving, it's because Kim Jong-un is cracking down on the regime. So you talked about the sanctions, about you don't know how North Koreans are suffering, like public are used to suffering. True, public is used to suffering. Elites are not. So sanctions have a secondary benefit of cutting off the fund that goes to the elites that supports the regime. I do, at the end of the day, believe truly for some solution to come about, for this crisis to resolve, it has to be brought about by North Korean people. So while we do that, we have a long-term solution of trying to get information into North Korea, try to get information to the North Korean people, because they have to ultimately bring about the change that needs. And that might be a long-term plan, but we have a short-term plan and a long-term plan.
Further questions? In the middle?
Hi, Rachel Oswald, reporter with Congressional Quarterly. This is for anyone who wants to answer it. But Jenny, I think you talked a little bit about unintended consequences of sanctions, how they've encouraged North Korea to become even better at skirting the rules, international rules, enticing more people to become middlemen and helping them to evade sanctions rules, getting into cybercrime, cryptocurrency. Can anybody talk a little bit more about possibly the corrupting influence North Korea could have on rule of law around the world as it feels pushed to use means of illegality to support itself that we may not be anticipating?
You guys, well, you talked a lot about illicit business and cyber security in your paper, right? So, I mean,
Well, this isn't really an answer to your question, but my feeling is that North Korea, time is not on North Korea's side. Really, they cannot go on this way forever. So I think the operative word for U.S. policy and the policy of Russia and China is patience. We just keep pushing these people. It may take 5 years, it may take 10 years. The main challenge is to try to avoid a war with North Korea in this period of time while we're trying to put pressure on them to get rid of their nuclear program. I think we're stuck with a situation that we're going to have to accept a de facto North Korea nuclear state for a while. I don't know how long this while is going to be, but we have to keep pushing and toward a comprehensive settlement. And I think I just can't imagine that we're going to be the same way 5 or 10 years from now as we are now.
okay, let me try to answer your question, because you were asking about cybersecurity and other illicit, like unintended consequences. I mean, already we know North Korea does this. They've been engaging with money laundering, I mean, there's cybercrime and every illicit business known to mankind. They have also proliferated. So proliferation is a very serious concern. They have not proliferated WMD yet, but they have proliferated almost everything else. So all of this is a serious concern. And it is true that the more they are squeezed, that they are going to look at for other avenues. So it's not, I don't want to sort of leave you with an impression that that's not going to be. They have, and they probably will increase these activities.
Professor Toloraya.
Sorry, may I use the privilege of, asking the two charming ladies, very qualified ladies, a very simple question which needs a very short answer. What are the goals of U.S. policy towards North Korea? Because over the last 25 years, I was formulated as, bringing down a North Korean state and unifying Korea, thus eliminating all the problems. Are the policy goals the same now? How can you formulate it just in a couple of words?
Do you want to go?
I'm not sure it is a couple of words. And Sumi might disagree with me, but I've always seen U.S. policy towards North Korea not as comprehensive as this idea that it's this long-term goal of unification. I think, the U.S. interest in North Korea has largely been denuclearization. And how do we achieve denuclearization? For many reasons, and one is the threat that it poses to our allies, and now to the United States as well. But, if we could achieve denuclearization of North Korea, then I think, the U.S. would be okay with then whatever inter-Korean relations happens in the meantime. I don't think there is necessarily a large, lofty, down the road goal, because I think then U.S. policy will turn towards other priorities at that point.
I don't disagree with Jenny at all. Actually, I think our U.S. policy has been very reactive. Always reacted to a missile test and nuclear test. I don't think we sat there and really had a long-term vision of what it is that we wanted out of the Korean Peninsula. Whether we actually are supportive of unification or not, I don't. I mean, we say it rhetorically, but I don't think we have really thought that through. And I do think we need a strategic, long-term vision of what we want.
In the front here.
Thank you for coming. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native, U.S. citizen. My question, we talked about the history and the past experience enough for the past year or 2 years or so. However, I'm thankful for you guys to really come out. My question to you, Sue and Jenny, especially. So what's next? Where do we go from here, and how we get to where we supposed to be? Is my question.
Well, I'll go first. I have an optimistic scenario and a pessimistic scenario. Because I'm convinced that North Korea will try to complete the program, and that's their goal. Even if they want negotiation, I think they will try to do that after. What I'm hoping is that, and I do think because North Koreans and Kim Jong-un is very smart about and very deliberate about every move. Like even the last ballistic missile test, it was in the middle of the night, probably worried about our potential intercept, that they will come up with a move where they can get to the close enough line where they can declare themselves, we have completed, we have re-entry, we have whatever. We completed it, but not so obvious that we can accept it. Well, we can still give us some deniability. No, that has not happened. And then maybe come back to the negotiating table at some point. But I just don't think we're there yet because I think North Koreans themselves are not interested in talks right now. That's kind of an optimistic scenario of us trying to avoid a conflict. Otherwise, we are in trouble because, as Jenny said, we are trying to give them a binary choice. Squeeze financially, diplomatically, so you either have nukes or you don't have anything. It's just really binary choice. But the North Koreans are doing that too to us, that we are absolutely keeping nukes, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you want to stop it, the only way you can do it is through a military option. Let's hope we don't get there.
Yeah. I think we differ a little on, where North Korea stands on stuff. And I'm not as convinced that North Korea will not negotiate until they finish the program. I think there has been, over the years, a very consistent message from North Korea that, the nuclear weapons is largely self-defensive. But the statements are always very conditional still, as long as there's, unless the U.S. hostile policy, blah, 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 blah. Which does, still leave an opening. But the difference, I think, is, again, because the U.S. interest has always been denuclearization. There's been the approach to North Korea has always been we only want to talk about denuclearization, or they have to agree to denuclearization before we start talking. And so it creates a negotiation environment where you have a winner and loser before you get to the table. So you need North Korea to look weak and come in at a weak position. And I think because it's been a very kind of lower strategic priority for the United States, we know it's a difficult negotiation. We know there's going to be bumps along the way. I think the U.S. has tended to opt for looking for guarantees that negotiations will work, guarantees that we can get to this point, guarantees that it'll be quick, and that, the stronger North Korea gets, the less likely that is. And so the idea that you have to have these preconditions, that North Korea has to demonstrate a certain behavior, has to change its behavior before it gets to the table, has been, it has been problematic in actually getting the negotiations going. And the question is, what can you actually accomplish at the table? And I think, there's always the arguments of we've been negotiating for 25 years and blah, blah, blah. But the difference is we haven't had a sustained negotiation platform for 25 years. We've had some stops and starts. We've had, several things that, as soon as there's any kind of obstacle in the way, we walk away from it. So, in that sense, it's very difficult to see how it's very difficult then to regain that trust, to regain that posture, and especially if you're going to make, your adversary come in at a weaker position.
I think there's well, we can do that after. I think there's a little bit of a disagreement here, and there's an actual difference. Right before the January 2016 test, nuclear test, Robert King also, we tried to reach out, and we tried to just simply say, we're going to talk about nukes. It's different from saying denuclearization have to be, you have to commit to denuclearization to come back to talks. We just said talking about nukes is going to be part of the program, and they didn't want that. So I think there is a difference. I don't think there is a difference between, we can argue all day, so we don't have to do that right now, we don't have time, but there's a difference between Kim Jong-il era and Kim Jong-un time. I think there's a difference there. I think it's true with Kim Jong-un, at least he paid lip service to denuclearization, and there was more willingness to negotiate. I really think at this point, right now, today, with Kim Jong-un, we're at a difference, and that's the difference of opinion here.
I just one clarification point, though. I think Renz had said earlier, time is not on North Korea's side. I would disagree. I think time is on North Korea's side. And they don't have elections. They don't have term limits. But they know the U.S. does. They know South Korea does. They know, Japan does. They know leadership in other countries always changes, and that you can have very drastic policy shifts from administration to administration. So when it comes to the efforts that come at the end of an administration in the United States, North Korea looks at it as, is this what we want? Do we believe that we can get something done before the administration exits? And even if so, will that last through the next administration? And I would have to say, there was a sense of optimism when the Trump administration came in that that there could be a different U.S.-North Korea relationship, and especially with the impeachment process going on in South Korea as well, there was an optimism that there could be a different relationship, an inter-Korean relationship, and so the North Korea does sort of look for these signs, does see these openings. But then, if you come out with similar policies, if you come out with hardline rhetoric, very quickly those windows kind of open and close over time.
Just one quick comment on the time not being on North Korea's side. I think time is not on either of our side. It's not on our side in terms of trying to stop North Korea from going nuclear without using military option. And in North Korea too, though, I just had a conversation with the British ambassador to North Korea, and he agrees. He's like, even after they get it, if we still don't give them the recognition, the prestige, and still sanctions are in place, North Koreans are not going to get what they want, which is they might have the nuclear deterrent capability, but we continue to, so it's not an ideal scenario that North Koreans want. So I would just point that out. I just think it's a timing, in terms of time, it's not really an ideal situation for either North Korea or the United States, depending on what it is that you want to achieve.
Well, we are unfortunately also out of time at this panel. I hesitate to cut off debate, but Renz, do you have any final comments to wrap up with?
Yeah, just one thing that I keep mulling over in my mind. Maybe Sue Mi can address this. How much of the North Korea nuclear program is for real? How much is bluff?
Well,
I've
both of you saying...
I've never seen a nuclear weapon.
Right, but they've
haven't
detonated it, and
missile.
you just said, what was the kilotons? You gave a three, you said it's 17 times the power. You said even if it's not hydrogen bomb, it's 17 times more powerful than the one we flattened Hiroshima. I mean, they've demonstrated it. Yeah, what do we want to actually? Do we? For us to conclude that they actually have nuclear weapons, and this is not my assessment. I think intelligence community and all the Korea watchers who's been following the issue now says up to 20 to 60 nuclear warheads, and they have achieved miniaturization. This is again also intelligence community's assessment. Maybe you guys know better and say no, I don't buy that. But these are hardworking Americans who came out with this assessment. So I'm going to go with that right now.
Well, this debate will continue, but after the panel ends. So please join me in thanking our panelists for this discussion.